All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for another one of our strategy primers here with the Center for Sustainable Business. We're excited at the cohort that we've organized today. This is the first time we're seeing this collection of folks all in the same room at the same time at the same space. And when we had set out on this, we had initially been thinking, all right, by this point in time, the IPCC would have released some insights around what needs to be done and what can we be doing, and ISSB might, and some others might. Little did we know that the SEC and ISSB would have all set their things down by this point in time. So we thought, all right, in addition to talking about opportunities for drawdown across all organizations that we don't often get to talk about a lot, like our ones in industries and small and medium businesses, that again, spaces that don't often make the main cuts of the conversation, we figured we'd be remiss if we didn't talk expressly about the recent SEC and investor conversations that have been going on. So we're very excited for today's conversation. We'll have a good keynote primer from our guests on that front, and then we'll get into the panel discussion with our representatives from each of those spaces. And to tee it up in advance, by all means, as we go along, please do feel free to utilize the Q&A function in there on Zoom. Hopefully you're all familiar with by this point. If you have any tech trouble on that side, let us know in the chat. I'm happy to try and guide you on that front. And also feel free in the chat to go ahead and chime in, share where you're calling in from. You would love to see where folks are hailing from in the kind of digital, not peanut gallery, but in the digital audience ballroom. So with that, just a little bit here about the Center for Sustainable Business. We are, for those of you who don't know us, all about really galvanizing businesses to thrive for all. And really what that work means is around 3 different work streams for today's reference, really around that just transition to clean and circular economies, thinking about decarbonized middle America. And how we go about that is a lot of thought leadership, applied research, education and training, and today being one of those examples of trying to bring some cutting edge thought leadership to the rest of the community, that ideas that you may not have often heard about before that are out there that are really at the cutting edge of sustainable business. So with that, I would be remiss if I didn't share just a brief little primer about where what we understand, one, is top of mind for the community. When everyone was registering, you all shared the different things, the resources that you would need that would be helpful to help you accelerate your own journey on that just transition to clean circular economies. Energy, information, things around incentives, circular finance, lots of different things, lots of different conversations, many of them recurring. So very excited to see around those. I will share that from the member companies that we work with who really support the efforts that we get into, I'm really glad to see that a number of them have scope 3 targets, and they're really looking at beyond their own operations, so thinking about their value chain. And many of them are doing it to some of the best-in-class reporting methods like TCFD. There's also a lot of opportunity where many of them don't know, hey, how are our 401k or retirement plans? Or what are the kinds of resources how can we set our customers up to understand how we're part of their footprint? So all of those things I think will key in well for today's conversation. With that, I'd love to introduce our first guest, Stephen from Ceres, as one of the experts that you'll be hearing out there in the space, really driving a lot of the conversation around what is the SEC talking about from this space, why is the SEC bringing this up, and hopefully this next little bit of the intro will shed some light on the 5% of the conversation that you may not be getting in the mainstream. I know there's been lots of focus around, has the SEC or are investors going too far? Have they gone far enough? But with that, Stephen, would love to hear more from you around what's been Ceres' experience and the investor perspective that you're hearing that may have led to this conversation with the SEC.
Great. Thank you, Chris, and university and all your colleagues, for the great work you're doing and for the invitation to join today. I'm just going to add a slide here, sharing. 1 second here. Let's see if I can. My screen is loading. While it's doing that, let me stop sharing for a second and just go back to this. So while I'm bringing that up, let me just give an overview of this issue. This is the most seminal issue kind of what we're facing now. People think about, 5 years ago, everyone knew where they were on, there we go. You should be able to see the slides. Okay.
Yeah, we got
that. So everyone knew where their position on the Paris Accord, and whether they were, even after the then president tried to pull us out. Sorry, my computer's a little slow today. I apologize. Tried to pull us out, where whether they still wanted to push forward. We think the SEC rule is similar, that it is a demarcation, and that companies, individuals, where they are will be something to be remembered. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but Ceres, nonprofit, we work with companies, we work with investors, working in policy. Most of our work, we do a lot of work with investors, that our investors overall represent, that's at 47 trillion. It's actually grown since then. So we spend a lot of time talking with investors, both in the US and around the world. The overall perspective of investors is that climate risk is financial risk. So this is not a climate rule. SEC is not a climate regulator. That's the EPA's job and others. Their job is to look at investors. When the SEC was established 88 years ago, they were established to provide a robust market for buying and selling shares. And the deal is that there would be a robust market in the United States in exchange for a lot of information, so investors could make good decisions. And they've done that in financial reports. They've done that in a whole variety of other things, including climate back in the 60s, and then in 2010, the climate guidance. So this is in line with disclosures that they've been making. If somebody said to a company, gee, I think I want to invest in your company, and the company says, yeah, but I'm not going to tell you what we're doing on the pandemic or what we're doing on cyber, you'd say, well, those are all critical risks. Climate is a risk like that as well. Around the world, financial regulators and investors are acting. So there are 8 countries that now mandate some form of TCFD, with more happening all the time. Last year for COP, investors that we organized and others around the world, collectively is about $60 trillion of assets under management. So over half of the managed assets. Submitted a letter supporting mandatory disclosure. So investors want this, and I could spend the rest of the time, I won't, giving lots of statistics and examples that again, investors, they're looking to invest their money on behalf of the fiduciary. So this isn't they're not doing it because they're environmentalists. Yes, they may be or they may not be, but they understand this as a big risk. To put that in context, there is more risk out there today with the large banks on climate issues than there was in 2008 on subprime housing. More on climate now than there was in subprime housing. And you think about the recession that we went through, the $700+ billion of the TARP, and all the other changes we went through in our economy. This slide in the bottom of it also shows the results of a survey that we commissioned, that SSRS and others administered it. And so random sample around the country, 87% of Americans and 74%, 3/4 of Republicans, said that they think the federal government should require large companies to publicly disclose risks. So what we're talking about today is strictly in the mainstream. There's nothing radical, nothing dramatic about this. And I want to go to the next slide. My computer decides it's time to freeze, which I always love in these presentations. So what does the report show? Whoops, let me go back. What we believe is that the SEC did a carefully calibrated report in their 500+ pages. Carefully calibrated meaning it wasn't everything we had asked for, but they looked at what were the investors asking for, and what were the companies asking for, and they tried to find a balance. So there's some things, and I'll summarize these quickly, that we think they went a little too slow or maybe not as far as we would have wanted. But overall, they did a good job. It does provide a level playing field. I spoke at a conference yesterday on all the different languages for ESG. And the reality is we do have somewhat of a Tower of Babel because there's lots of disclosure out there. 92% of the Fortune 500 companies are disclosing something, but they're doing it in different ways. They're doing different times of year. They're disclosing different elements. Not all are doing greenhouse gas emissions. So this will build on what the SEC has done before, but provide more consistency. What do investors want? They want the information. There's this business axiom and that you can't manage what you can't measure. And if you don't have good, consistent information, if you're an investor, whether it be any of us in our 401k or like the BlackRocks or State Streets are big, and they're looking, gee, there are 5 fill in the blank. There are 5 real estate companies, 5 agricultural, 5 restaurants. I want to compare them. Who's doing the best? And right now they can't do that on climate issues. Imagine if we didn't allow, if 10Ks weren't public, they wouldn't be able to do it on the financial side. And this is, again, what investors asked for. So we did an analysis of all the investors that filed comments last year, and it could have been some of the folks on this call. I'm going to ask you at the end, I hope all of you submit comments on or before May 20th. But of the people submitted for last year, this is in the comment period, 3/4 of the people asked for TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosure implementation, which is what the SEC did. And almost 2/3 of investors asked for including scope 1, 2, and 3. So the SEC included scope 1 and 2. They included scope 3 in certain cases, which I'll briefly talk about. So not for everyone, but they did include all of those. So again, the SEC is responding to what investors have asked for. Nothing new, nothing radical in terms of going forward. So they're saying that they're basing on TCFD, which is, again, I'm sure many of you are working with, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. It's been around for several years now, over 3,000 companies, 8 countries, and it is baked into what investors are talking about, and it covers some 4 key elements, which are in the SEC requirements. The other thing that is going on, as Chris said earlier, is the international elements. And 2 weeks ago, the IFRS, through their ISSB, apologize for the acronyms, the International Sustainability Standards Board, came out with their draft rules, and there was a lot of alignment. There are some things where the ISSB goes a little further, some the SEC, and happy to talk about that, but there's, and that is intentional. We've met with both the head of the SEC many, many times, and last week the head of ISSB, and they're doing that intentionally because we want to have convergence, right? We want to get out of this Tower of Babel, and the ISSB, they're combining the SASB, the value reporting, and a lot of work with CDP. They have a memorandum of understanding with GRI. Again, I apologize for all the acronyms, but what it's leading to is a consistent set of numbers. Imagine, again, if for financials, if company X reported it in yen and company B reported it in lira, you wouldn't be able to compare them apples to apples. So it's also very important to understand what the SEC did is great, but it's nothing radical. In fact, we're behind other countries. And if you're a company, you want to raise money in the US, well, right now you are limited in other countries because you don't have those disclosures. So what are these? So this is good for business as well. Doesn't mean that businesses all want it. There aren't a lot of businesses that say, yes, government, I want you to add more regulation and more forms I have to fill out. And what are the kinds of risks? There are transition risks and physical risks. Transition risks, again, there are a lot, just from looking at the guest list, a lot of you are very sophisticated and could do this presentation in your sleep and better than me. So I will apologize. I should have said earlier, I'm not a lawyer. I don't speak for the SEC. So these are just high level comments. And I'll share my email later if there are questions. But transition risks, as we transition to a lower carbon economy, as there are policy changes. Last year, because of the pandemic, the oil companies wrote off $145 billion. This year, they're doing very well. So those are affecting the industry one or the other. Physical risk, fires, floods, and I just read an article that the reinsurance industry feels they're not going to be able to write all of the policies in Florida and California, and their insurance companies leaving those markets. So it used to be that we'd say, oh, I'm not going to worry about it, I'll get insurance for it. Yeah, insurance might be a little more expensive. Well, A, a little more might be double or triple or quadruple, and B, you may not get that insurance. The other thing the SEC has asked for on the right side of this is the opportunities. Climate is a risk, but it's also an enormous opportunity. We're going to go, we, the world, is going to go from spending a few $100 billion a year on energy and climate solutions for emerging markets, a few $100 billion, to over $1 trillion a year. That's companies that can grow their solar business, their battery business, their wind, carbon capture, et cetera, et cetera. And so depending what business you're in and what your supply chain is, this could be a big opportunity. And then the SEC has said these need to be reflected in the financial statements. I could literally spend the next hour just on that one point and what part of the financial statements and the 1%. There's a lot of nuance here. Do not take what I'm saying as a comprehensive summary of the 510 pages, but there is elements there which we think are very strong. So the four key elements within TCFD: governance, strategy, risk, and metrics. So governance, how is the board organized? How do they make decisions? And so that every public company will be following those. Information on strategy, looking at the risk management. And, for example, if you filed a net zero plan, the SEC said they want to know how we're going to get there. And then a number of metrics. And they also use the GHG protocol, the greenhouse gas protocol. Again, there's a sophisticated group. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but scope 1, the direct emissions. Scope 2 is the energy used for those direct emissions. Scope 3 are the supply chain. And that if the scope 3 is material, what do you define as material? The Supreme Court has ruled, again, I'm not a lawyer, but Supreme Court has ruled that if a regular investor would think it's material, so if investor, I want to know that, then it's material. So it's up to the investors to know. Or if an investor said, I'm thinking of filing a shareholder resolution, but I want to know that. I'm thinking of investing more money, then it's material. We happen to think that most companies it would be material, but that's a separate question. And for scope 1 and 2, it's phased in, starting with the largest company. So the first filing is in 2024. And then for the other, it's on a graduated basis through 2028, with small reporting companies exempted for some of those along the way. So we think they've been very thoughtful on that. Again, they talk about in the proposed rule, the physical and the transition risk. They talk about the impact on your business. Just as if you said you're a business owner, I'm going to expand to 4 new countries. I'm going to pull out of Russia. I'm going to merge, whatever big strategic things, those will affect your balance sheet, your staffing. I'll give you an example. The automobile companies that I'm oversimplifying, they all say they're going to go essentially to EVs, some by 2030, some by 25. Oversimplification. Well, that has enormous impact on their capital plan, but it also takes between a third to a half of the staff to build an EV that does a fossil fuel. So it affects your staffing. So those strategic decisions affect a lot of things. The other thing that's very important is that this information is filed in the report. So it's not just on your website, it's in the financial reports. Again, I talked about scope 1 and 2. Scope 3, it's in for the largest, and if it is material, that the information for the largest has to be third-party assurance. So it can be a CPA, but also could be other types of assurance parties, engineers and others. And there are a variety of things just on that. These are areas where we believe the SEC has made accommodations. So in some of these cases, we think they went farther than we would want to go, but this shows the balance of what they've done. So from adding a materiality test to the safe harbor, that's a legal protection. So one of the concerns was, hey, what if I project energy is going to be at X and it turns out to be Y? As long as you've done this in good faith. I mean, 3 months ago, the 600 plus companies who have now pulled out of Russia in one way or another, no one knew they were going to do that. It wasn't in their plans, but they've done that in good faith. So again, the SEC has exempted some small companies from reporting. There's a phase in for GHG, greenhouse gas emissions. There are reportings on other things. So these are all ways that they've listened to the marketplace. We think, as I say, in a carefully calibrated way. Some of these have gone a little farther than what we want, but we think there's a balance. So in summary, before I turn it back, this is, as I started, a seminal moment. We hope you all submit comments. Let me say that again. We hope you all submit comments and I'll include a link with more information by May 20th, and comment on what you like and what you don't like. Don't just comment on what you don't like. Yeah, I don't like page 82 that says X or Y or Z, because this is a record for them, it's for the public, and for the courts, if it does go to court. And so if you like A, B, C, D, E, F, D, put that in there. And then say, I hope that G changes for this. I think it's, instead of a 5-year phase-in, it should be a 3-year phase-in, or whatever you happen to think. So this is very important. All of you are and I hope you encourage your clients and other people in your supply chain to submit comments too. We have lots of material, and I'll put a link to our website in just a second, where we have a statement of principles. So if you don't do your own comment, you could sign a statement of principles if you support it. We did a webinar with the chairman of the SEC. We have a link to there too. So we have more information. But let me turn it back to Chris with deep appreciation for everyone's time. Chris, back to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Stephen. And I see some folks already starting to send over some questions, either to us directly or generally in the chats, and we will take those. Know that we will be taking preference from questions that come in through the Q&A, because it's easier to upvote and react and whatnot and respond in there. So whichever way works for you to send in the questions, dear members of the community, please do send them in. Just preference, if you can keep them coming in the Q&A. While we get more of those coming up, would love to start bringing the rest of our panel in for some reactions, and also to build broad aperture a bit and see how this is resonating with different folks from different places. So first up, Greg, would love to bring you into the conversation as someone from the more carbon intense industries. How is this investor conversation relating to you, or even more generally, what's your thinking around, hey, coming in an industry like cement? How does this climate conversation resonate for you?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Chris. Yeah, so as CEO of Chement, we're a cement technology company looking to work with these big cement companies to help lower their carbon footprint. I think there's been a lot of movement towards trying to kind of quantify the carbon footprint of their products, and I guess this goes towards these maybe scope 3 emissions if you're a concrete producer, or maybe a building company, construction company. But I think I really liked Stephen's point about the fact that there's a lot of different conversations about the impact of different companies, and it's all in different terminologies. But what I've really enjoyed recently is there's a new standard called these EPDs, these environmental product declarations, that seem to be grabbing on hold to create this nutrition label, as you could call it, for these products that are being made. So I think it's great that the SEC is requiring companies now to disclose their environmental impacts for their investors. But I think one other interesting thing you could do is, as a consumer, maybe we could start demanding these EPDs to understand what we're buying, and then therefore, having a better choice. And another good thing on the back of this is that the General Service Administration has just decided to pass standards related to their procurement, related to cement and I believe steel as well, requiring these EPDs to hit a certain standard. And so I think as this kind of is moving forward, both as investors and as consumers, I think we can start to demand a little bit more transparency. That's just what I'm seeing. Perfect.
And again, for those who do not know, it's kind of the one of those shadow industries in there. If I remember correctly, Greg, cement, if it were a country, it would be the 4th largest emitter behind US, China, and number 3. So again, one of those often glossed over things that we're trying to help surface here as part of our Decarbonize conversation. With that, and kind of building on your point around, thinking about if you are the consumer, what can you be doing? I know, Sheryle, you have shared some of your experience with that, not necessarily a climate tech company yourself, but how you've baked that as a small business into your thinking and the kinds of clients that you work with or the kinds of vendors that you work with. So would you help us broaden this? Like, what is the small business perspective on what Stephen teed up, or just the whole Decarbonize journey in general?
Yeah, so there's so much to add here, and I don't know where to start quite. Thank you again for having me here today. And Stephen, thank you for the presentation. That was excellent. I even learned some new things in that. From a small business perspective, I mean, it's something that we care about. And I saw a question in chat about what is considered a small business. I'll let those of you in the know of the actual definition to answer that question. But we definitely consider ourselves a small business. In our county, I think it's like you make under 50 million or something like that. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm a small business. We're local here in Fort Worth, Texas, and we are a web agency, and people assume that, oh, well, digital, that's automatically green. And going towards technology, we're not wasting paper, we're going green, we're going digital, but there's such an energy consumption sort of behind the scenes there. So as a tech company, I have learned over the years the impact of that. Just last year, for example, with the pandemic, we were like thinking, what else do we need to measure? Because I think Stephen said, you can't improve what you don't measure. And we definitely are looking at that. And we measured our Zoom carbon footprint for the first time. And in doing so, we had to actually dig for like, where do we find that information? And it was actually universities and research at universities that was giving us the ability to measure that. And 4 metric tons was our Zoom carbon footprint last year. And it was the first time we had actually measured it. And I think that most people don't consider those things. But as a company that does care about climate action, my personal consumer choices, as Greg was mentioning, are definitely impacted by that. And I would love to see that climate friendly tag on your Amazon purchases. I would love to be able to understand what that means for climate action. And I would like to be able to see, that as a consumer, but as a business owner, I get to choose who my suppliers are. So we are hosting our websites with green hosting companies. And now we're looking even further at that and wanting them to be a little bit more granular in understanding, like, okay, you're paying for carbon offsets. Are you really green? Is this really a green host? Like, what else are you doing? Where is reduction happening? What does that mean? What projects are you investing in? We're asking a lot more questions. And we didn't ask these questions the first time we got into this. We're like, oh, yay, green host. And that was wonderful to take that step in that direction. But once you're down that rabbit hole and if you care about it, you start to ask yourself more questions. And the more you learn, the more you can do and the better you can actually help.
Awesome. Thank you, Sheryle. I appreciate that. Having gone down that rabbit hole a few times in a few different branches myself, and happy to follow up with anyone. I know there are lots of resources out there. We'd love to compare notes on that front for folks. But I think, Sheryle, you and Greg have both done well in teeing up, and Stephen as well, a couple of different perspectives. And so we'd love to bring Gillihan in from Project Drawdown. And for those of you who are tracking along the way, there was a slight guest change that we had, so we are still in COVID days. Unfortunately, Aiyana fell sick here earlier this week, but we are very appreciative of her colleague, Gillihan, being able to join us. And Gillihan, very glad to have someone from Project Drawdown here especially from the perspective of climate solutions at work. I think I shared that it was really frustrating trying to figure out what are all of the different things that we should be thinking about, because while Stephen mentioned there has been some stuff from the investor perspective, a bit more frameworks coming together of like, how might you think about things from the doer inside the company, like, what are all the different things that you could be doing? And our fellow panelists have touched on a few things. So curious from your perspective, what are some of the how does what they've shared resonate with you, or are there other things that folks should be thinking about? Is there one that you're really excited or really concerned about that needs more acceleration? What's your experience in this whole decarbonization journey?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And yeah, too bad that Aiyana is out sick today. But yeah, I'll do my best to cover for her. And yeah, thank you all, and thank you, Steve, for the great introduction and presentation. I think like the thread that I see that kind of connects to all of us, I think this is a great like diverse panel. And I'll do like a little zoom out and tell you a little bit more about Project Drawdown and my background. But it's just amazing to see there's so many, the way, you know, the work that Project Drawdown does is really focused on climate solutions. And there's, you know, it's such an amazingly diverse field. There's so many different inroads that people can take. And I think this panel represents that pretty well, like small businesses thinking about it, you know, innovating in like these hard to decarbonize sectors with the industrial sector and cement. And then also thinking about the sort of financial levers with the SEC rule, which is extremely important, and thinking about how investors and, you know, how we can shift capital to really like scale climate solutions. So I think like generally this is just a great panel and excited to be here. So I'll just zoom out. So yeah, my name is Julian Krause-Polk. I come from, so I work for Project Drawdown, which is an organization that's focused on climate solutions, like I said. I'm just going to drop in the chat. This is like an overview of our solutions framework. And so I'm going to talk about two frameworks in this introduction. So one is the overall drawdown solutions. So that's essentially drawdown, similar to the IPCC. They've in the most recent report, the Working Group 3 report, they also looked at solutions. But we've done this analysis since starting in roughly 2014. We published a book in 2017 that became a New York Times bestseller that was called Drawdown. And at the time, it was the 100 most effective solutions to climate change. And we still are updating that research and kind of creating a framework for how we can start to think about solutions. And so we kind of think about that framework in multiple sectors. So that's the electricity sector, the food, agricultural, and land use sector, the industry sector. So cement and steel that we talked about would fall in that industry sector. And that's like a notoriously hard to decarbonize sector. The transportation sector and the building sector. And each of those various sectors have, you know, a certain amount of greenhouse gas emissions that come from those sectors. And so in those each of those sectors, there's like kind of these diverse possibilities for how we can start to decarbonize those sectors. And yeah, that link, you can get a lot more information on that kind of like whole framework of solutions. And then there's also work to do. So those are all the kind of emissions, and then like, you know, the sources of carbon or the other greenhouse gases. And then there's also opportunities to support sinks and then also improve society. So we have kind of like this 3S framework, which is reduce the sources, support the sinks, and then improve society. So we kind of have this whole taxonomy of solutions. So that's kind of what Project Drawdown is most well known for, is like kind of like reflecting back all the opportunities for solutions in the world. I work within a smaller program, and we actually do a lot of work with Ceres. That's called Drawdown Labs, which looks at how businesses and also employees within those businesses can help sort of accelerate or leverage their power to like accelerate the wider adoption of those climate solutions. And so we developed this framework, and I'll put this in the chat as well for folks to follow along. Wait one sec. That's called the Drawdown Aligned Business Framework. And essentially, we break it down. So this is like, what can businesses do to leverage their power and influence to scale up climate solutions? And so we break it down into emissions reduction, stakeholder engagement and collaboration, products, partnerships, and procurement, investment and finance. And I could go kind of into much more detail into all these areas. Climate policy advocacy, climate disclosures, which is like a key, you know, aspect that we're talking about today with the SEC rule, and then business model transformation and long-term thinking. So thinking about, you know, like the Chement is like a great example of business model transformation and like sort of addressing a climate solution with their very business model. And I can go into more details, but maybe I'll just leave it at there for now. And the last thing I'll say is the one thing that we really kind of are into is also giving employees the power to take this framework and influence change within their companies. And I guess maybe just last thing to kind of tie it back to the SEC rule, if you're an employee within a company in the audience, it could be worth you reaching out and getting like the whole entire company to say something in support, submit a comment. And so that's like power that you as an individual have to kind of influence your company to kind of take this bigger step. And that's just one example. But.
Perfect. Thank you, Julian. And that, apropos, happened to be having conversations with some accountants later today. They're all wondering about that. Had breakfast with some students. They were all wondering, like, what can they do in their roles? So, with that, we'd love to bring everyone together. And I know, Stephen, that you touched on this a bit briefly in your opening remarks. One question that we've got in, and would encourage folks to continue submitting in the question field. Q&A field, and encourage you to use upvotes for questions that you want to prioritize. I know we tend to get robust amount of questions in here in the webinars that we've done before, or the strategy lunch and learn. So Stephen, maybe you can help us kick it off. I know that Greg, you talked about product labels as well, so we might broaden this from the consumer or the customer perspective too. But one question that we have from Professor David Sanchez is around global frameworks. So I know, Stephen, there's already a bit of convergence with SASB already folding into the Value Reporting Foundation, and then that's now folding into ISSB with IFRS. And I know that each of those are really aligned around TCFD, but there are still a smattering of other ones that are out there. GRI or otherwise, right? So, where do you see that heading, and what kinds of things the folks are thinking about this from the investor perspective or the operations or otherwise? What should folks really be keeping as their North Star?
Yeah, so thank you. Important question. And again, all the panelists have very thoughtful comments. First, on the financial side, what's happened over the last decades. The SEC was established 88 years ago, and in different countries, similar agencies have been operationalized. But in most countries and most stock exchanges now, there is good financial transparency. Not every country, but that you can look at that, and there are whole sectors of our economy, investment analysts who read 10Ks to look at that. So there's good transparency on the financial side. There is not that exists on the climate side. And just last year alone, we had storms that cost us $145 billion, and over 20 storms over $1 billion each. So what's happening is there's 140 countries that uses the same basis for the financial records, IFRS. And so IFRS has set up this sustainability board. They appointed the former head of Danone, yogurt, and others to run it. Very forward-thinking guy, very thoughtful. They're recruiting a board. They've issued these draft rules. They issued them, I think it was on March 21st. I encourage you to go to their website. They have a comment period through July. Again, it's very similar to the SEC. But imagine, and then a week ago, or last week, or 10 days ago, Canada issued mandatory disclosure for banks and insurance companies. Again, using TCFD. 8 other countries, they're in various stages. Some go further. The UK, what they do is for the largest round numbers, 3,000 companies, so the larger companies, you have to not just file your disclosure, but you have to establish a net zero plan. How are you going to decarbonize? That's further than what the SEC is going to do under our rules. But we're going from 20 years ago having no systems, then having lots of voluntary systems, not many people are using them, then voluntary systems that a lot of people are using, and with a lot of overlap and not convergence in the words, to more mandatory so that there's common language. So overall, I think that's good. For some companies, it will reduce some it'll add costs, they haven't done it before, but some it'll reduce their costs because they're not filling out 4 different forms, is one set of forms. For investors, you lead to a robust market. Investors, if they don't have good information, they tend not to invest. So if you have a company in Europe that has good climate information, a company in the US that doesn't, if everything is exactly the same, to be overly simplistic, you're going to tend to invest in Europe. So this good information will ensure that we have a robust economic market and keep it going. So the work of IFRS, the work of the EU, UK, go through a long list of countries, is all heading in a good direction. It's not all going to be exactly the same, but we're using the same principles. And so I think that is great. There's more to do, but the SEC is a big step. I also would encourage earlier in the word cloud you showed on the pension work. That is very important. So the Department of Labor has issued a draft new rule that will encourage this. Today, if you're an employee, if you have a 401k, 95% of you do not have the option to invest in a climate fund. So I would encourage all of you to go to your company and say, for my pension fund, can I invest in a fund that thinks about climate? And if not, why not? I'd like to add that. I also encourage all of you to go to whatever bank and insurance company you're asking and ask them, do they have a net zero plan? Are they filing comments to the SEC? You're very powerful. And whether you're a residential, just an individual or a business account, those are things you could all do tomorrow. And if we don't all do them, we're likely to have this watered down because people on the other side are trying to politicize an issue that shouldn't be. It should be science-based, and we need everyone to get involved. Have I said the deadline is May 20th? I figure if I say it 8 or 10 times, just trying to remind people. Back to you, Chris.
Sure. I don't know, Julia, if you want to build on that one? Yeah,
sure. I could just add on a little bit. I just want to emphasize the kind of 401k piece and pension funds. That's a leverage point that I think is undertapped, and it's something that we talk a lot about within our kind of investment in finance, like leverage point. And just to bring some numbers to that, so an organization called As You Sow did some research on this, and based on their assessment, kind of a generic number is like 5 to 7% of one's 401k would be exposed to sort of direct financing of fossil fuels, which if you build that out to the rest of the U.S. economy, comes out to I think it's almost $400 billion that are 401k / pension funds are being invested in kind of primary fossil fuel production and expansion. And so that doesn't include deforestation and other high carbon intensive activities. So if you include those, it's probably more like $500 billion that it's our money in our retirement that's being invested in these things, these kind of climate destructive industries. So it's a lot of power, a lot of influence that we have, and it's certainly people need to step up and talk about that because it's really their money that they're investing. So just wanted to hammer that home.
Yeah, and to build on that and expand it out a bit, Julia, Sheryle, for you and Greg, would love to get you in on this. I know for CauseLabs, you all have thought very much about benefit corporation, B corporation, right? How are you signaling to others, or what are the labels of companies to be working with, or climate neutral, right? So I'm curious from your perspective, are there frameworks that do you need to sign up on everything, because that in and of itself has a time and has a financial cost? What are the kind of convergence of things that you've seen from a small medium business size that if you only got 1 hour to go after something, what are you going after, right? And Greg, similarly for you from that more carbon intense industry space, what are those types of frameworks that you see that are kind of converging that folks should be paying attention to?
Yeah, from my perspective, I think what are your values and what is it that you care about, and what do you have the time and effort to be able to go tackle? You don't need to necessarily sign up for everything. You don't necessarily need to start by getting certified in everything. I'll also speak to the fact that small businesses are exempt, but that doesn't mean that you can't make a huge impact. I'm a big believer in the 1% difference, and what you can do as taking one step forward and another step forward. And there are, 32 million plus small businesses in America. And, if every single one of those took one step forward, that would be a huge impact and a huge difference. And so I'm happy to share, and I'll drop the link into our chat. We've also, if you lose the chat link, if you go to our website, we have our emission tracker that we use. And this was just our step in the right direction, because there isn't for small businesses yet a great place to just go and input all of our information so that we could see what our carbon footprint was. And so we created a Google spreadsheet and we're happy to share it with everybody. So I'll just drop that into chat, and you don't have to measure everything on there. If all you can do as an organization is log into your Zoom and see how many hours of Zoom your organization is there, and that's what you're calculating, it's a step forward.
Awesome. Thank you, Cheryl. Greg, how about for you from that more carbon intense industry space? What kind of frameworks are you seeing in the alphabet soup of things that folks should be honing in on?
So in the cement world, I don't think I'm actually seeing many frameworks. So a lot of actually I should say all of the cement companies, and there's only a handful of major cement companies. These are large, like multinational companies that kind of buy up all the smaller cement manufacturers. They've all committed to going net zero by 2050, but there is no formal kind of definition of what that means. And I don't think there's any auditing on what that path is. So I think things like what the SEC has announced are very important. And I guess in Europe as well, or at least in the UK, requiring big companies to actually disclose how they're going to get to net zero is very important. Personally, I've looked at these plans for net zero and have thought that they are so kind of vague that I've made a whole company that basically is on the assumption that they cannot do it without some other technology. But I think the solution is getting towards what I mentioned is these EPDs all the way down to the consumer side, because things like these heavy intensive industries are commodities. It's hard to tell. You got cement here, cement there. It's all the same. But what can differentiate it is, okay, this cement was produced with this much impact on the environment versus this one maybe has a little bit less. And there could be a differentiator there. And just to answer a question I saw in the chat of who would require this, I'm not sure anyone at this time would have to require it. But I think what could happen is that people who are in procurement, so I guess if you're a university building a new building, you could say, I would like to keep my carbon footprint below this, and require your suppliers, put it in the spec, say, I want this, and I will guarantee you will get it. Because the only way these cement companies are going to change is if the end user says, I will not buy your cement unless it hits my targets. That's how you're going to change the market. So there's no current framework now, but I think it has to be driven kind of from the people who are finally buying these commodities that are really carbon intensive.
Awesome. Thank you, Greg. And this speaks a little bit to value chain. So this might start as more of a technical question between maybe Stephen and Cheryl, but again, we'd love to broaden it out because I know we've commented on how the smaller companies might be exempt from the SEC disclosure piece. One piece that I've seen, and I've heard that piece often in many of these conversations, but one piece that I haven't really seen addressed is if we're looking at larger companies disclosing to their investors more about their exposure, their risk exposure, and their plans across their value chains, that means they're going to be looking to the folks in their value chains who are often the smaller companies to be disclosing and having these conversations around what are their footprints. So I know Cheryl's already shared a lot of really great resources. I would plug the SME Climate Hub and the variety of others that she threw into the chat. But Stephen, I don't know to what extent that, and maybe that's something that the SEC is soliciting comments around, or like, hey, how would this impact you operationally as part of someone else's chain, or how should folks really be thinking about these opportunities to engage with their value chains?
No, it's a great point. First, for a lot of companies, depending on the industry, their emissions of their value chain, of their scope 3, could be 60 to 80%, sometimes even more, of the total. So if you're not looking at the value chain and you say you have a net zero plan, it's like saying, I'm on a diet and I have a salad for lunch, but you forget to tell somebody that I had an ice cream at 3 in the afternoon. It's just not the whole picture. And you're not going to get where you want to go. So the value chain is very important to look at. In terms of the SEC does want to know about the regulatory burden, and that's part of why they've extended things. Again, there are some companies where their first filing is in 2028. Now, at the same time, let's all be clear, Mother Nature is not going to wait. Last year when we were having COVID and Hurricane Ida affected the East Coast, it was during the Jewish holidays, literally biblical proportions. At the very same day, the West Coast was facing a drought that was later reported to be the worst in 1,200 years. So Mother Nature is not going to wait for this. But the theory of the SEC is let's focus on big companies first, and then the supply chains over time. But what we've seen in many things, financial reports is one, is that the larger public companies started, but then the smaller companies are asked to do it too by their investors. They just want good information. I'm not saying small company, if you're a 2-person deli on the corner or something like that, that's very important. But it's good to know, but that's not going to have individually a dramatic impact. Collectively it would, but go from there. And again, the SEC has definitions. They have, without getting too technical here, accelerated large filers, regular filers, and then small reporting companies. And I put a link into what they call the small reporting companies. And they look at this as how much money you're trying to raise from the investor world. That's how they define it, which is different than some other programs. So it is relevant it does affect all small companies for customers. 70% of employees in national surveys say they want to work in companies that align with them. So whether the SEC requires it or not, it is going to be a competitive advantage in recruiting and retaining employees and customers and good press. Back to you.
Awesome. I don't know, Sheryle, either you or Greg or Julie want to build on that. And we got a question in from Joseph around like, hey, what can smaller businesses or mid-sized businesses, what can they be doing to really respond in this kind of anticipated pressure from the larger customers? Go over, Julie.
I was just going to add one little point onto the kind of like scope 3 conversation around it, just emphasizing the fact that the kind of the cost breakdown. So like for cement or for steel, some of these like raw products. So in a lot of industries or for a lot of companies, right, the like scope 3 emissions might be the 60 to 80%, like Steven said, of the greenhouse gas emissions. And it could be like for like a cement manufacturer, like it could be a huge expense to make it green cement. You might have to like double the cost. I mean, you could speak to this better, Greg, but from the production side of things, like the cost to the actual like consumer, whether you're like a building company, like building like a building, the cost is relatively low because there's like those materials currently, those like raw materials are extremely cheap. And so, I mean, these are statistics that I've just heard recently that like cement for building a building, cement is, like, I think it's like 0.5% of the total cost of that building is like goes into the cement, even though cement is obviously like by volume, a huge part of the building. But so if you were going to double the cost of that cement for that building producer, it's only now, 0.5% more in terms of their cost, right? To make that, to prioritize that green cement. So from like a cost perspective, you could really be kind of accelerating these solutions downstream with very little, like relatively little cost to, the end consumer in this scenario. And I think there's a lot of opportunities to push the, public institutions and governments to start procuring these like products and procuring, green steel and green cement and accelerating the adoption of those solutions downstream by just, tacking on that slightly larger cost. So yeah, just wanted to kind of like add that element in terms of the price dynamics to it as well.
So, Sheryle, Steve, you came off happy to transition to you. And Julie, I would be remiss if I didn't mention, because I know that Project Drawdown and Ceres and I think others on the line here as well, there are some times when there is that still green premium. I think that there's often the misconception out there among mass that everything that is more sustainable has a green premium to it. And there are lots of things out there that make more investor sense or procurement sense. So like, hey, this is less cost up front, it makes more sense as an asset investment in the long haul, and it happens to be more energy efficient or more carbon efficient. So I just want to frame that, like at the moment, for more carbon intense things, there might be a premium. For many of the options that are out there for folks, there often is not, and it might even be more economical. But Cheryl, just want to make sure we didn't have folks leading with thinking that everything had to have enough charge on it.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah, definitely energy efficiency and the cost of solar and wind, everything is dropping. So certainly there's a lot of financial incentives going in the direction of sustainability these days.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Cheryl, didn't want to cut you off.
No problem. I just wanted to answer Joseph's question now that I've had a chance to read it, and just say that as a small business, we're not quite feeling the pressure yet. I don't know if your business is feeling the pressure. However, when we do, or even if you want to take action before you do, knowing that this is coming down the pipeline, the first thing is just to start asking questions and start understanding things about your supply chain. For example, we didn't bank with a smaller local bank because they didn't have any action plan. Not that we wanted to choose a larger bank necessarily, but we at least had an answer to the question. And now, we're evaluating and looking at switching, but I think it's the first step is to ask the questions. And, it can be your 401k, it can be your bank, it can be your supply chain, it can be a lot of different things, but start asking those questions. And once you're mindful of that question comes up more and more often.
Awesome. Well, I want to be respectful of folks' time as we get near to the top of the lunch hour. So I don't know if there are any lightning round ideas. I know we've had a lot of different things from everyone, which have been great resources, and we'll make sure to share those out afterwards as far as recording and also links. I don't know if panelists think like, hey, if there's one thing, one resource that we haven't mentioned yet, that hasn't come up yet, the one thing that carbon intense industries, smaller, mid-sized businesses, investors, whomever, whatever hat on any front, as we're thinking about ways to decarbonize our lives, our companies, our economies. Is there one resource that folks have that if I got to mention this before we hop off the conversation today, as far as opportunities for folks?
I would just say quickly, democracy is not a spectator sport. If we really care about economic democracy, we all participate, submit comments, write folks, engage people. Many of you are thoughtful in collecting information. Share what your business is doing. Thank you to Chris and to the distinguished colleagues.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephen. Appreciate it. And with that, we've hit top of the hour. So I want to thank all folks for joining us today, and stay in touch for our next Lunch and Learn strategy primer. And otherwise, happy Thursday, happy Earth Day, Earth Week, Earth Month. Every day is Earth Day, and we will all be in touch, everyone. Take care. See y'all.
Thanks so much.
Take care. Thank you.